On this week's episode, the greatest cheaters in motorsport history.
We're talking about F1 from Michael Schumacher to 1984 to more recent, maybe something that happened in Monaco.
Talking about the greatest cheaters in NASCAR history, everything from back in the day to the most recent races.
Going to GT racing, rally, and even a new one, esports.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to episode 7 of the VROOM podcast. I'm your host, Wills Jones, along with my wonderful co-host, Simon Martell.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to a special type of week. As you probably remember from last week, there was no F1 race this weekend. The next F1 race is going to be next weekend, and so we decided to, make a little special episode. We're going to be talking about maybe some controversial topics, but definitely some very interesting concept. We're talking about cheating in motorsport, and I think right away when we can talk about cheating, it's not just breaking the rules. It's kind of an art form. What do you think?
They really have to be creative.
Yeah, it's like, it's not just the scummiest win. No, it's like the smartest are going to be able to do it.
Yeah.
So relative, I mean, the smartest depending on whoever, but okay, so there's some distraction on my side, but we can talk about F1 first. So there's a lot of different motorsports out there, and today we're going to be talking about a couple of them. We're going to be going through some F1 cheating scandals. Then we are also going to be talking about NASCAR, some GT racing. I'm happy you put in this category, but what was it? Esports? I think that's a great one. And then we also have rally. So all of these should be pretty interesting. They go through, I don't know, like the last 40 years. Like it goes through a lot of different periods. So yeah, should be really interesting. Some of them I got inspiration while getting vaccinated. I mean, I was listening to some people talk in some videos. So there you go. So that helped talking about that. All right. Anything else to add on your side before we get started?
I would say the sort of idea for this podcast sort of popped up out of, the Red Bull's whole rear wing thing and how, some teams are saying that that's cheating, and sort of the ways like how cheating in motorsport is very different than sort of cheating in every other type of sport is sort of like something I thought would be interesting to cover.
Yeah, I love it. And I think we'll go back to it again a bit later, but it's very relevant. A lot of people call back to those scandals when things happen nowadays. So an event that happened in Monaco, a lot of people were referencing to a scandal we're going to be talking about a bit later. So there you go. It's always good to know our history. So I think what we can start with is F1, just because this is kind of both of our favorite motorsport and the main theme of this podcast.
Main focus, yeah.
I want to talk about something in 1984. So 1984, that's almost 40 years ago. I think the main thing right away to talk about is how different the cars were at that time, as well as the regulations. So F1 is almost an always evolving sport. So a lot of rules and change happen relevant to technology. And that's when a lot of people find the edge or kind of that loophole that becomes cheating. So let's get started. So this is called the 1984 cheating scandal. It involved a couple of teams, but let's start a bit earlier. So in 1982, some of the rules set in by the FIA specified that cars had to weigh a certain amount and would get tested after races. So this was something that companies made to make sure that there wasn't the cars weren't being run at an unsafe weight, that they were too light and could be dangerous for drivers. And then at that point, the rules also specified that they had to be that they could be weighted, but they could also have their usual fluids filled before they get weighted. So that could be gasoline, that can be heating oil, that can be like lubrication. So all those liquids that you can kind of burn through during a race, you are about you were allowed to fill it back up before the car got weighted at the end of the race. So if you can think that the main reason this rule was in place so that there wasn't any main modifications happening to cars that would break rules during or after the race. So one of their main thing was that, for example, around that time, because of those new regulations, teams like Brabham and Williams used these rules to kind of develop a cheeky workaround with the fact that they could refill liquids. And so what they did was they had water-cooled brakes, which means that the cars would start the race weighing a pretty large weight, and they had a large water tank that was full. And throughout the race, the water would be released in the general direction of the brakes. So it wasn't really useful, but it was a way for them to pass the weight inspection at the start of the race. And then somehow, who knows, but after a couple of laps, 2-3 laps, that whole water tank had been used to cool the brakes, and they didn't need it for the rest of the race. And then the car ran underweight compared to what they weighted initially, and performed better because they weighted a lot less with the same power. And then just when they got tested at the end of the race, well, they would get topped off again with the right amount of water in their brake cooling tanks to make sure that the weight limit was not breached. So that's in 1982, teams started doing this, and it wasn't illegal to say, but it wasn't necessarily, and so during that season, that's what teams like worked around. And as we see still to this day, when teams kind of find a loophole, find a little thing they can work on, the FIA is quick to put in measures so that it doesn't happen for more seasons to continue. So
I think the best thing,
yeah.
And I think like the best thing to remember too is that oftentimes like the cheating is strictly because these teams are like, well, you didn't say we couldn't in the rules.
Yeah. And so that's kind of what happened, was that after 1982, they said you couldn't. And so fast forward a couple of years later, in 1984, you got to think technologies is changing, it's evolving, the sport is evolving, and now all of a sudden, there's only one team that's using a naturally aspirated engine. All the other teams on the grid have moved to turbos that have a lot more power, but especially at that time, turbos were a lot more expensive, a lot more complicated, and so some teams were not didn't have the financial means or the engineering capacity to run them. So in 1984, that was the case of the Tyrrell racing team, who still had a naturally aspirated engine. And they got inspired by the 1982 water tank kind of workaround for their strategy, because at that point, a turbo engine was a lot heavier because of the turbo and the extra machinery. And so the minimum weight had been lifted for every other team. And so Tyrrell, who had the naturally aspirated engine, had to wait a lot more to be legal. And they didn't have the benefits of having the turbo to produce a lot more power. And so they were at a really big disadvantage for that season because of the fact that they were obligated by the rules to weigh a lot more. And it was just a disadvantage at that point for them. And so this is so to remedy that, to be able to weigh enough, they decided that the engine was going to be equipped with a water injection system, so to reduce the temperature of their cylinder. And then that supply tank of the water, the water cooling, was able to be topped off late in the race. So back then, you also had fuel refueling and everything. So usually the last stop during the race, they would change the tires, maybe top off on fuel, but then also they would fill up that water again, so that just for the last couple of laps, it was legal and would pass the test when it would get tested. Yeah, sorry. So there you go. So that's why Tyrrell kind of did that. And then as well, what they realized with that, when Tyrrell was racing, they realized that lead shot could be escaping from the top of the car. So they found out that the Tyrrell car was underweight during the entire race, breaking effectively the rule. But right at the closing stage, so their last lap, while topping up their water injection system, they wouldn't just put water. They also would put gallons of water that was mixed with almost 140 pounds of lead shot, just to make sure that the car was heavy enough. And so this would mean that because of the pressure they were putting the water in to have a quick pit stop, some of those lead shots weren't making it to the tank. And so while the cars was leaving the pits, some of those lead shots which didn't go into the tank would spill out. And there was so many of them that other pit crews had to like come with brooms and broom away the lead shot so that it wouldn't like impact their cars. And so that's kind of how they got caught. And they got a really big consequence because of that. They were completely excluded from the 1984 World Championship, lost all of their positions, lost all of the race or their points they scored so far, and got disqualified for every single race. And so that was a big scandal at that point, especially for Tyrrell, who were a team that were struggling financially and were still kind of holding out, not getting a turbo. Well, this effectively forced them to move to the turbo era for the next season because they got disqualified, didn't get any points, and because they were running underweight with their naturally aspirated. Some speculate that this was kind of the move by the FIA to force them to force every team to move to turbo, because at that point F1 was losing sponsorship, was losing race viewers, and they thought that the turbo made it more interesting, sounded better, more power, and that's what the sports needed. And so that's some people with their tinfoil hat could say that the weight rule was implemented to kind of force every single team to move to the turbo. And so that's the story of how Tyrrell kind of tried to get out of having a turbo for that year, and they got caught and had some pretty bad consequences from it.
And like to think back to the 1984 turbochargers, like they were nowhere near as efficient as they are today. Like I've talked to my dad about, like, well, like, yeah, like some cars were naturally aspirated, some were turbo. And he told me like, yeah, the teams really, like, it was kind of a flip of the coin as to if you thought turbo or naturally aspirated would be quicker. And it sort of turned out that turbo cars were slightly more fuel efficient because of the extra air going through and the more efficient air to fuel ratio. So because of that, a lot of teams switched over to the turbos. But yeah, also just and having the turbo lag kick in, like with the naturally aspirated engine, you get that power right away, where with the turbos it takes a bit and then it all hits you in one big slam.
Yeah, so already in 84, you can see that the changing technology kind of forced people to find rules around it. And this is kind of what I want to, that kind of leads us to the next one, if you're ready for it. 10 years later, 1994, another big scandal happened. So, well, before we go, I kind of want to just give a little shout out to one of my favorite podcasts out there. After this one, maybe you guys can look it up and search for it, but Donut Media have a great podcast as well. And they were talking about the 1994 F1 season. And I got some of my info, but definitely my interest from there. And so, yeah, let's head to 1994 to kind of give an idea of who was at that point. This was one of the first season for Michael Schumacher. Ayrton Senna's, that was his last season in F1. And a lot of technology has been in F1 at that point. And the biggest thing about 1994 was a lot of regulations which changed the sport. And so those new rules that were being introduced included some a major announcement like that electronic aids are to be banned, which means power brake, traction control, ABS, all of those recent technologies that had been created had started to appear in F1 throughout the last couple of years, and racers have been enjoying it. It had to help like control, and I think that's like one of the greatest part about F1 is that usually you get like, they always at the edge of technology and advancement, and so yeah, they have all of these. Yeah, go for it.
If I can just jump in, I have up there on my wall the stories of Ayrton Senna. So it's got basically everything from his karting days and up until his crash and afterwards. And it's all everyone who ever knew him, raced with him, was his friend. They all have their stories in there. And in there, I find it interesting. Ayrton Senna led the push to get rid of all electronic aids. And a lot of people um, speculate that if there were still electronic aids on the cars, then Ayrton Senna would still be alive.
Yeah, exactly. It's something I'm gonna be talking about, because what you see is that when they did ban all of these electronic aids for the 1994 season, what happened was that they banned them because kind of the saying, or what the F1 management was afraid of, was that a lot of the driver skills were kind of being replaced by just engineering, like technology, and so it mattered a lot less if you were a good driver to just about if you had a good car and good engineers, and that they thought that wasn't what F1 was about, and that's kind of the official reason all of those traction aids and all of those electronic driver aids got removed. Now let me put on my tinfoil hat again. Another thing that happened, and that could kind of, that a lot of people say helped those rules getting in place in 1994, was the fact that Ferrari was was lagging behind a lot because they just didn't have the engineering. They hadn't followed the technology ramp, and they didn't have the driver aid, electronic driver aid, that other teams had, and they had been performing horribly for many years.
And we
And
all know the
so
FIA plays favorites with the red team as well.
well, yeah, they're definitely teammates more than authority figure to competitor. And so, while those rules had been implemented, another big one that got implemented that year as well was reintroduction of refueling during pit stops. Again, this kind of gave an advantage to Ferrari, who was running a V12. Oh man, I can't imagine a V12. Oh, those sound so good. And then while other teams had V10s and V8s that were a lot less fuel hungry. And so tinfoil hat again. Yeah, refueling definitely helped out Ferrari because of their engine. They had difficulty finishing races. And so, so from the first race, with those new regulations, suspicion and speculation started that some teams were still using the driver aids, even though they were illegal. And so young driver Michael Schumacher at that time, racing for the Benetton F1 racing team, was involved, or at least had a lot of suspicion against him that they were using software that helped him do faster pit stops, faster laps, and easier and faster, and helped them being faster off the line.
And so it was,
yeah,
I was just gonna say it. Everybody suspected that it was traction control, but sorry if I'm getting ahead of you. They were using a launch control system. I do believe. I may have the total era wrong here.
No, so the biggest thing was that they never they never could prove that they cheated. How the rules worked at that time was that they were prevented. The rules was against them using the traction control and those softwares, but the rule wasn't against the existence of the software on the cars. And so what they found was that the FIA had proof that the software was on the car, that it existed, but they never had proof that they used it during a race. And so they never got punished or a follow-up consequence of, because the FIA could never prove that they used it during a race. And so
that's so cheeky.
Yeah, well, you do say launch control, traction control, all of these, it looks a lot like they did have it. You see during, for example, lap times, the Benetton racing team had about a second off compared to everybody else. And so you can kind of wonder, what could that make it, how could that happen? But yeah, they never got any consequence from that. Another thing that happened in 1994 that kind of wraps up this season that was very controversial was the death of two F1 racers. Roland Ratzenberger as well as Ayrton Senna both died at the same Grand Prix, the San Marino Grand Prix. Kind of what we can realize at the end of the day was that cars were getting faster. Engines were performing better, the technology always improving. It's a story we still hear to this day. But FIA changing the rules from 1994 and removing all driver aid kind of just made it so that the cars just were staying as powerful as they were, but lost a lot of the technology that helped control it. And a lot speculated that this led to the losses of those two F1 drivers was because of the rules implemented so late before the end of the season. Cars that have been designed to use those software, the drivers that had trained on using those software, and all of these features that got removed right before the start of the season made it so that it was a lot more dangerous for the drivers because the car had been designed all along to use them and got removed for the season.
And so, just on
yeah.
If I can just expand on that weekend, also from my Ayrton Senna book, a fan like in the paddock asked Ayrton to sign the weekend schedule thing that they give you, and asked him to put the date on it and like Ayrton asked why do you want me to put the date on it? And the guy said, well, you don't know, this might be your last race. Like, I want people to know that you signed this on your last race. So
that's dark.
Yeah, it's a little dark, but
and so
people can be awful.
Yeah, to kind of wrap up the 1994 season, the season that had been controversial so far finished on a very controversial note as well. Michael Schumacher came into the last race with a 1-point advantage to his next rival, Damon Hill. And the last race of the season in Australia, Michael got a convenient crash with Damon Hill, knocking them both out of the race and ending up so that he won the championship with 1 point over him. And there you go. So
and you can look back
that was
through
the start of Michael Schumacher's incredible record. I think we can talk that he's kind of a controversial racer. He's had more than one very convenient crash, but
a lot of very convenient crashes.
This was definitely the start of it, gave him his first championship. And at the end of the season, Benetton, the winning construction team, never officially got proven that they cheated during a race, but they had the software installed throughout multiple races, and that's been proven as well. And so I guess it's just, if you about personal belief, if you think they used it, or if they didn't, they had a lot of excuses, like it being for test drives, it being for preseason, it just never got removed, that apparently it wasn't accessible to racers without a hard reboot. Yeah, okay. So there you go. That was the 1994 season.
So then we move on to Spygate in 2007. So this is, I think, one of the most interesting and maybe dumbest F1 cheating scandals. So in 2007, McLaren and Ferrari were very much the top teams dueling it out. So McLaren decided that they would send spies to the Ferrari factory in Maranello to get the technical briefings on the Ferrari car that year. Now, they send these technical briefings back to the UK, to the McLaren headquarters, and apparently McLaren didn't have a printer at their headquarters. So they went to like the UK version of Staples and got these technical briefings printed out. I'm sure a guy walks in with a McLaren name tag on, asks this guy to print out stuff, and it's all just got Ferrari Formula One on the top of each page. So the actual print store employee reached out to the FIA and ratted out McLaren to the FIA. Like they probably would have gotten away with this had they just printed off these documents at their own headquarters and not outsourced it. So the FIA ended up fining McLaren $100 million and excluded them from the Constructors' Championship that season. I don't remember if they won or not.
No, it got very convenient that somehow they had some engine problems throughout some race. And so tinfoil hat, some say that part of the secret arrangement was that they couldn't win that year as well. So yeah, a couple of disqualifications from some key races made sure that they weren't in the top. So that was Spygate. And then finally, I think we can come to Crashgate, which I was talking about how it was relevant. I kind of want to say before we move on to Crashgate, I kind of want to talk about Michael Schumacher again. We were telling about a couple of controversial crashes. Well, 1994, that crash which gave him his championship. Surprisingly, he had the same again opportunity a couple of years later, where a couple of points was separating him from the runner-up for a championship. And that runner-up was Jacques Villeneuve. And somehow at the last race of the season, during one of the turns, he crashed into Jacques Villeneuve. But
I watched the replay of that
things
race.
Worked out. Yeah, as things worked out. Michael Schumacher car didn't survive, while Jacques Villeneuve kind of bounced and could finish the race. And so that's how Jacques Villeneuve won the championship, and Michael did not.
Yeah, watching that happen is pretty funny. So you see them going around the corner and, they're both leaving each other space. And then just about halfway through, Michael just cranks on his steering wheel, slams his car into the side pod of Villeneuve's car. And actually Schumacher destroyed his suspension and front wing and did little to no damage to Villeneuve's car.
And it's not also his only moment. So he also had a moment in Monaco where he failed to finish a turn during qualification while he was on pole and red flagged the session, effectively making it so, he would start first. And it wasn't like a crash like we saw with Leclerc where he destroyed his rear suspension and everything. No, it was a tap. But he just didn't have the turn radius for his car to get out of the way, maybe touch a little bit the front wing, and then, you're going to have to red flag the session. Isn't that disappointing? That time, though, the FIA decided to punish him. They thought it was too convenient and maybe a bit too obvious, and he got a penalty that made him start from the back of the grid.
And now, just to sort of sidetrack again, Nico Rosberg did a similar thing in 2015 or 16. To secure himself pole. Yeah, he just stopped the car at turn one. Was like, I don't know, shut down.
And to talk about crash, finally, I know we're pretty good at segue. This is our last kind of controversy for F1 is the Crashgate, which is a big word that kind of came out last week when Leclerc had his crash in Monaco. We just talked about a couple other drivers who've had crash, and while I don't think Leclerc's crash was was intentional, especially with the consequences that happened. I hope for him he didn't do that on purpose because he would look kind of stupid. But Crashgate, what happened was in 2008 in the Singapore Grand Prix, a racing driver named Nelson Piquet crashed on purpose under team order to bring out a safety car to help his teammate Fernando Alonso win a race. So Alonso at that point was racing for Renault. His teammate was Piquet, and it came out later during the season when Nelson Piquet got dropped by the team. I think he was kind of salty and came out to the authorities and said that he had team ordered to crash. And so the truth, and so Renault, as well as their directors, got into court and got sued by the FIA and the racing authorities because of the alleged cheating. And the consequences that happened was that the managing director, Flavio Briatore, and the executive director of engineering, Pat Simons, both had to leave the team. They got handed a lifetime ban and banned for 5 years, so respective to each one of them. But then later on, some French courts decided that maybe that was too grave of a consequence, and he got turned over. But still, people thought it was such a big deal that they got some ban from racing. They lost their title sponsor midway through their season. So ING, which was a big financial company, just decided that they couldn't support cheaters, left halfway through. So that definitely hurt them a lot. They lost a lot of points from racing. So it was definitely, they definitely had a lot of consequence for that one win. Finally, Renault, the racing team itself, did not get a fine because they decided that the team itself wasn't the one responsible. They didn't want to impact jobs for all the engineers back at the factory. Finally, Alonso did not lose his victory. He still kept it. So they didn't retroactively cancel the race or remove the points from Renault, but they definitely punished the one they felt was responsible.
Man, I kind of love when that happens in racing. They're like, hey, like you guys really like you cheated here, and then we know it, but we're gonna let it slide.
Yeah,
like we could take your points away, but we'll just let it go.
Yeah, and well, Renault, this is kind of another. I think this is the one. Maybe I've mixed up my stories, but Renault did not win the championship that year. As again, kind of a secret arrangement. A couple people would say that they were not allowed to win the championship after a controversy like that. Wouldn't look good for the sport. And so that was Crashgate. While doing the research, a lot of other things came out that I think are very interesting. Around 1999, a lot of suspicion was that teams had figured out a way to intercept the signal that was sent to the flashing lights from the marshal for the start of the race. And that way, give an audible tune in the driver's ear, like a tenth of a second before the light would go out, so that they would have a perfect launch every single time. It never got proven officially, but you can look it up, and it's very funny. One race in 1999, the FIA changed the way they would do starting lights. And so instead of a sequence that would go automatically through that gets started and go through its sequence as well with the radio signal.
Like a computer program to just sort of do it the same way every time.
The director manually took control. And so he started first light, second red light, third light, and then waited before dropping them. And you see the top 5 cars just go and completely miss their start. And it's hilarious because then the back burners who you could say didn't have that system didn't move. And while the top runners who maybe had that system left and kind of criminalized themselves, but nothing ever came out of it. No teams got penalized, but from that point on, the FIA changed to a completely random system so that teams couldn't exploit the launch procedure.
And on a similar note to that, I remember a race in, I think, 2017 or 2017, because it was Valtteri Bottas for Mercedes, had an amazing start. And for like half the race, his start was under investigation because you're supposed to react to the start and not anticipate it. And the FIA thought he got off the line too fast for it to have been a reaction start. So like they spent so long analyzing like when the light goes out and when his tire starts to move to figure out if he cheated or not, which I thought was pretty funny that you're not allowed to anticipate the light going out. You have to react to it.
Yeah. And so maybe one day we'll do a part 2 of cheating, because there's a lot of those instances of over engineering and kind of going around the rules in F1. But hopefully you enjoyed those those little extras that we found for you. Next, we're going to NASCAR. What do you have for us, Will?
So in NASCAR, there's some really like interesting and just weird ways people have cheated in NASCAR. So I'm gonna start off with I think one of my favorite racing driver names ever, my man Smokey Unick.
Oh man, and he has like an incredible life. I think he came out with a biography, and it's very crazy. You go on his Wikipedia page, crazy guy. You know,
He is
back in
like
the
one of
days
the
when they
best
would.
cheaters in motorsports as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Like I think anytime he ran a car, it was not legal. Like there was something special going on with it. So I think his one of his most infamous cheating scandals was in 1967. He was running a Chevy and they had left NASCAR the year before. So they pulled out in 66 and he was running a 67 Chevy. So because it wasn't like an officially homologated NASCAR spec vehicle, he was able to modify his 67 Chevy to be 7/8 scale of what the actual car is. So it's not like a huge difference, but it's enough to punch a far smaller hole in the air to go a hell of a lot faster. So his car was smaller than everybody else's. And then he had the body offset on the chassis in a certain way to help him go around the corners better. And like just the way the airflow went around it. So he
It's
was never disqualified for any of that. They let him race with it because it's NASCAR and it's back in the day and fuck, run what you brung, right?
I also
So
think it came out like a bit later that an engineer talked about it. Like I don't think they've ever noticed because of it. What's crazy to me when I heard that story was
well, it's because he had
did they
two
never
7/8 scale
yeah, did
cars. He had one out in
yeah.
the parking lot that he built two of them, one in the parking lot and one sitting in his paddock. So they went out. They're like, "There's no way that's the actual size of the car." He's like, "No, go out. I've got the one I bought from the factory out there." And so they go measure it out. They're like, "Oh shit! I guess they Chevy just built a small car this year."
It's crazy to me because like I imagine like they would compare it to the other cars in the pack and just be like, this car is off. Like what's wrong with this car? But it
And well,
never
like if
worked.
they're
It never happened.
skeptical,
So
why wouldn't they
yeah.
just go to a Chevy dealership and be like, "Hey, can we like measure your car quickly?" But no, they're just
It's
like,
probably
"All
because
right,
there's like 60 cars, and yeah, they
yeah, it's
didn't
just
care
too
too
much
much. But
time."
how incredible the amount of effort to do that.
I know. So then, if we go to another one, another great NASCAR name, I think NASCAR has some of the best names in
Oh
motorsports.
yeah, for sure. The very
Uh,
like such great redneck names too. Like the double. Exactly. The double first names always just kill me.
Oh man, well this
Johnny
one is just
Johnson.
Johnny Johnson,
Jimmy
Ricky Bobby.
John.
Oh, here we've
Bobby
got
Bob.
Junior Johnson. So Ford had pulled out of the 66 season. Junior Johnson wanted to race. So he arrived in an extremely modified stock car. So, these things are supposed to, race on Sunday, sell on Monday. It should be the body should look exactly the same with the same engine. The only difference is that there's no interior in the race cars. So he arrived with a different windshield, so it deflected the air more efficiently, a shorter roof than the car had, and wider fenders. Um, and once again, freaking NASCAR, he wasn't punished. Um, but in the 90s, Junior Johnson owned a team and he was caught cheating with like wonky engine intakes. So I guess kind of karma bit him in the ass a few years down the road. But I find it like there are so many of these stories in NASCAR where it's like, oh shit, like that car is nowhere near legal. Yeah,
Yeah.
go out and drive it.
See, you got to think about it, right? They're all the same exact car, almost doing the same exact lap with no main like points for driver error. Like there's not like that chicane and like the big braking difference. So there definitely the engineering makes a huge difference if you can get that 1 or 2 like kilometers faster per like on the straights. Well, over 200 laps, that makes a huge difference. So I can definitely see why they need to do it.
Yeah, and so forget what I was gonna say there. Um,
Well, you can talk about maybe the next driver that you had on the list, Jeremy Mayfield.
yeah, so Jeremy Mayfield in the 2006 Daytona 500 ran illegal gas. So a gas with probably a higher combustion rate, give his engine a little bit more oomph when he gets to go. Um, so they found that out for that race. He was disqualified from that race. He won his next race, and then the team dropped him, and he just kind of like vanished off the face of the earth. Like
Yeah,
there was so much bad publicity from him trying to cheat in the Daytona 500, which is the biggest race on the NASCAR calendar. Like if you're gonna cheat, don't do it at the Daytona 500. You know?
man, every time for me, the craziest thing is that you got to think that, like, those racers are always surrounded by what, 15, 20 people team. That's a lot of people in on it. And he's the one who, gets the tail end of the stick. Like he got played. Like, yeah, he's definitely part, like, he's part of the scam. Like, I'm sure he was aware, but he's not the only one who cheated in this, in this system.
Yeah, and like you see it in NASCAR a lot. Like the teams don't really get penalized for stuff that teams I think should get penalized for. It often goes straight to the driver, which
Yeah, and like something you just reminded me talking about illegal gas. If you don't mind, we'll go back to F1. A great story I heard, which I really enjoyed, was that at one point in F1, they started limiting the fuel tank size, right? Just because of regulations, trying to control more that cars would be similar. And so they limited the fuel tank size, and some cars were just not able to finish the race. Their engines were consuming too much fuel, and so some teams figured out a way to to get more fuel to survive and to finish the race. They I'm trying to remember the exact term, but
is
they
this
not froze, but
the
no, no,
basketballs in
no,
the fuel tank? Oh,
no. They cooled the gas to such a point that the density of the gas was reducing so that they could fill up a couple extra liters in the tank. And so what they found was that right at the start, before the gas could start heating up and expanding, those teams that did run the cold gas were like doing everything to burn their fuel quick, because there was a risk that if they didn't burn all that extra gas in their tank size while the car was running and the gas was heating up, it could
would just
expand and
blow up.
expand to such a
Yeah.
point that it would blow up 100%. And so I think they ran for one or two races before the FIA got wind of it and completely banned it. But every time you got to find a certain way to make it work.
Well, man, this goes back to I'm not sure of all the details on this story, and I've heard it in passing a couple times. I totally forget the driver, but back in like the 60s and 70s in Trans Am, they limited the how your displacement of fuel tank. And so there were guys showing up with fuel tanks that seemed, visually looked like they were a gallon or two bigger than they should be. And so what these guys did is they inflated like soccer balls and basketballs, put them in their fuel tank, resealed their fuel tank. The legal teams then poured fuel in. We're like, oh, okay, yeah, it has enough fuel. So the judges and stuff walk away. They open up the fuel tank, take the
Oh my
soccer ball out, close it back up,
God.
top it up with the extra amount of fuel that they needed, and they're good to go.
Nice, of course.
Well, so then if we move on to the next one, this far less exciting NASCAR name. I'm sorry, just Ken Schrader. Nothing exciting about
Uh,
this one.
I mean,
He
Shredder is a great name for a race car driver. I mean, better
This is
shred those
true.
tires.
So, and speaking of shredding tires, so Ken Schrader realized his tires weren't going to make the end of the race. So he decided to simulate an engine failure on his car to make the rest of the field slow down. So what he
Oh.
did is you have your fire suppression system, which is, your your fire extinguisher. He pulled it and just put it out his window. So that there's a whole bunch of smoke blowing behind him, so that everybody thinks he's gonna blow up. They all slow down, and he flies across the finish line in first, so that he could go a little bit slower and preserve his tires to the end of the race.
There's no way he kept his win.
No, I don't think so.
Oh,
No
it
way.
was an accidental discharge of the system.
I didn't know I was doing it.
It was a mechanical failure of the safety system. If I was me, I wouldn't put any safety, but it's because of you, the racing committee. So it's basically your fault, and I should keep my win.
Exactly. So then moving on now to the king of NASCAR, Richard Petty. In the 1983 Miller High Life 500, he modified the engine of his car, and ran 4 right side tires. So,
Okay.
so that, like, I'm not 100% sure how he managed to make that work, but so all the tires were designed to be on the right side of the car, so that, like in NASCAR, obviously you're always turning left, so your outside tires need to be stronger. So he made it so that they were all evened up. He was also running a 382 cubic inch engine. The regulated size for the engines were 358 cubic inches.
Okay.
So he's
he
a fair
bought
amount
his-
over.
Yeah.
So,
That's
and
crazy.
the crazy thing about
That's-
this is that his win at that race still stands, despite running illegal tires and a very illegal engine. But he was docked 104 NASCAR championship points.
You got to think too, at that point, like 83, Richard Petty had been racing for a while.
He was old.
does that-
Needed to find an
does that mean
advantage.
he was cheating beforehand? Does that mean he's always been cheating? Was he just, fuck it, I've done everything, I don't care at this point? Like, I think it's pretty crazy that his, like, you know, compared to other athletes, I think this is something interesting to talk about. But those racers don't usually get the bad rap that, like, cheating in other sports entail. Like, I'm thinking about, like, Lance Armstrong. Like, man, that guy has become like, nobody wants to be around him, you know? Like, he's definitely been, like, rejected from the spotlight and everything because of his doping scandal. Man,
But,
Richard
like, the
Petty
cheating in motorsports is almost celebrated. It's like,
yeah, exactly.
Good job.
It's impressive. Like, oh, you found a way. Like, and nobody talks about Michael Schumacher as the guy who's been taking out, well, maybe a little bit, but he's still, like, very respected as a great racer. And I'm just thinking about all of these where it's like, yeah, Richard Petty is, like, definitely, like, one of the greatest legend, and nobody thinks about him as a cheater. And well, he definitely did, and he got punished for it. So it's pretty crazy that the standards are a lot different for motorsport.
Well, I mean, you can even go back to looking at F1, crashing people out. Like Senna and Prost 2 years in a row crashed each other out at turn 1 of the race, so that, like, the one or the other could win the championship. Like, those two, like, the stuff like that in racing, and, like, they do that, and, no one really gets docked for it. So now if we move on to GT racing, so this is just a thing that I thought was funny. So I looked up cheating in IMSA racing, and I saw this headline: teams so bad at cheating they were asked to leave. So I looked into this. I was like, well, obviously, like, if they're super cheating, like, of course they're going to get asked to leave. So here's the direct quote from IMSA's technical director Jeff Barter. He said, "Look, this is racing. We know guys are going to skirt around the rules and cheat. We have Parker Darren and his Barworks Motorsports around. So, like, they know that the rules are going to be broken and stuff.
That's a good reputation.
But, like, at least he's like, at least the, Parker Dawn and Barworks Motorsports are being cheeky about it, and, like, being sneaky and stuff. This team NAP, where they're just plain horrible at it. You make your car 100 kilograms lighter than the rest of the class, then go 1.2 seconds faster than everybody else with your slowest car. multiple times. Like, how dumb are you? We just said go home and learn how to cheat and come back to us.
That's hilarious. Wow.
Like, they're just so obviously cheating. They're like, okay, guys, like, at least try and be sneaky about it. Like, leave, figure out how to do it, cheeky, and come back to us.
Yeah.
It's just amazing. They got booted for being bad at cheating, not for cheating.
Man, that's so funny. And like it's definitely probably one of the biggest thing as well is like when once people starts having suspicion, that's when usually people get found out because there's a lot more scrutiny and people are trying to find like, okay, how can you engineer to cheat around the rules?
And usually like you're trying to gain like maybe half a second, 200ths of a second at most, not 1.2.
That's the craziest thing is that there 100% there has been some teams that have cheated and have won, and it's just they've cheated so well that nobody knows of it yet. Maybe we'll get it when someone dies in 20 years and writes a memoir or something, but there's still
I
some
can't wait till
cheating
the
that
can't
happens
wait
and
till
we
the
never
Lewis
know.
Hamilton memoir, and he's like, oh yeah, like our car was running ABS and all-wheel drive the whole time.
Imagine. Yeah, we're just paying fat sum of money to the FIA.
Yeah. So if we stay in GT racing and endurance racing, so in the GT World Challenge, it's all different manufacturer cars. So you have Audi, Porsche, Mercedes, Lamborghini, Ferrari, and I think Nissan's in it as well. So what they do to sort of even those cars out, because they all obviously have very different aerodynamic properties and very different power to rate ratios. They put a success ballast in the car. So adding 10, 20 kilograms per position you get higher up. So you'll see, and I watched the Paul Ricard 1,000 kilometer race over the weekend, and the Audi's my favorite GT racing team. I'm a four rings guy all the way. The Audis were terrible. And I was sort of halfway through the race. I was thinking, like, why are they so bad? And then the commentators come on and they go, Audi's doing what they always do at this race and sandbagging so that they can have lower success ballast for the next race at Spa. It's like, oh,
That's crazy.
that makes
That's
sense. And so
crazy.
there was also at the 12 hours of Bathurst, the Mercedes team was super slow in qualifying one year, all just so that they could run their cars super light because they hadn't tested them around the mountain with a ballast on them. And they knew that they were the fastest car with no ballast, but they were worried that if they go fastest in qualifying, their car's just going to be terrible. So they told all their guys to lay off in qualifying, go slow, just get the car around, keep it safe. And that way we'll have no ballast for the race and we'll be able to go as hard as we want.
You know if
I
they won?
thought, I don't know if they won. So much happens in the 12 hours of Bathurst. Like it's such a hard track. Cars get obliterated there all the time. And moving on to BTCC, back in the day, super touring cars. This was the late 80s, mid 90s for the British Touring Car Championship. These things were insane. There were drivers getting paid more to race in the BTCC than they were getting paid to race in Formula One. Nigel
That's
Mansell,
crazy.
Nigel
Wow.
Mansell, Nelson, like a bunch of top drivers would go race BTCC events to get a cash in a big paycheck before the Formula One season so that they could be comfortable. So
That's cool.
Alfa Romeo, realizing that there's quite a stage here to stand upon, entered the Alpha 155 V6 Ti. Now, if you have Assetto Corsa, you know that this car is an insane all-wheel drive missile. Well, it technically wasn't legal. So the cars all had to be homologated. So race on Sunday, sell on Monday. The car looks the same on track as it does in the showroom. Well, the Alfa Romeos looked slightly different on track, and that's because they had pop out aero pieces So the front splitter of the car on the street version was tucked up underneath, and you could undo some latches and it would fold down, and then you could fold the
Ah,
latches back in and the splitter would be there. So technically it's a homologation piece, but it
yeah.
wasn't sold that way. There's also a spoiler that you could fit to the car, but it was sold just with the spoiler sitting in the trunk. So you had to take it off and
Oh,
put the spoiler on yourself. Alfa Romeo argued that, well, the car is sold with the aero pieces, therefore we can run it. And the BTCC argued, well, is it sold that way in the dealership? And they were like, no. So it changed that all the alphas, they changed it all around so that selling them, they were sold with the um splitter down and the wing up, which dropped the sales
let's
for them
go.
because nobody wanted to buy a car that looked like that. It didn't look very nice as like a road car to drive around with the splitter down and the wing up, because it was
Okay.
super aggressive aero.
Yeah.
So they ended up not racing with the car. I think they moved it to DTM, where you can add in extra aero pieces and it's not as homologated or as strictly looked over.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. That's pretty funny. I love the homologation rules, especially like when you look back at like
I
F1
really want
racing,
homologation
not
to come
F1, but
back,
yeah,
like
you
GT
look at
racing.
NASCAR racing. NASCAR back in the day was kind of cool. I'd love to see Chargers and Mustangs like going around. Would look cool.
Yeah,
But
I really want NASCAR to actually go back to North American stock car racing.
yeah, I
Like,
don't know. I feel like the problem with it is that as a viewer, we have so much choices that we wouldn't really want to watch cars go like in a circle that are going to be slow. Like they're going to be a lot
yeah.
slower than the current cars. So I don't see it happening, especially now that like a whole new set of regulation is coming in for NASCAR. So that's going to be exciting. But I agree with you. Homologation is really interesting. I love like, for
Well, and
example,
even
all
then,
the
like you can
stories
do
with
like
like
souped up homologation special cars like that
yeah,
all through like the 80s and 90s. There were
yeah, Group
homologation
B,
special cars, and yeah, the Group B stuff. Like you could buy an insane race car for the streets, like
yeah.
insane stuff. So I think for us consumers, I want homologation to come back because I want to be able to buy a race car.
Yeah. Well, you see it in like GT2 and stuff where they sell the
Yeah,
Porsches GT2 and RS and stuff. But yeah, I definitely agree. But I think there's places for both. But homologation is cool to think about like, okay, what's the difference? Is they have the budget for new tires every race, maybe a couple aerial kits. Like, man, pretty much like a lot of people can do that. That's cool.
mm-hmm. So and if we move on to rally now, Audi, when they first entered the FIA World Rally Championship in 1983, they kind of cheated, but not really. It was another one of those, well, you didn't say we can't, so therefore we can. It was running their all-wheel drive. So basically, they have the meeting at the start of the year where they're all figuring out what rules they're going to do and who's competing where and all that stuff. And so before 1983, every team had run a rear-wheel drive car because they were lighter, easier to maintain, didn't break down as much, just all around more efficient. So Audi came in with their idea to run four-wheel drive. Now, obviously, a four-wheel drive system is more complicated and wears more on the car, so and it's heavier. So a lot of the teams were sort of speculating like, oh, like they're just going to be slow, like it's fine, let them run with it, like it's just Audi, that no problem there. And Audi kicked everybody's ass. They didn't win the 1983 season. That is the last time a rear wheel drive car won the World Rally Championship. And I think it was the little Alfa Romeo, forget what it was called, but it's this little, basically it's a super short wheelbase Ferrari is what it was.
Nice.
An insane little car. But so yeah, the all-wheel drive Audis in pretty much every event destroyed the rear-wheel drive cars. It pretty much just came down to the straight line speed that the Alphas had, that they were able to beat the Audis. Like the Audis were tearing it up through the corners with their all-wheel drive, super smooth slides and stuff. So there were calls for it to be disqualified, but it was one of those. I think the FIA also kind of realized like, oh, this is way better for rally. Like it looks a lot cooler to have dirt flying off of four wheels. So let's do that.
Yeah, and I think as well, like a part of that story that I find really funny is that during that initial weekend of trying to figure out the race and setting up the season, they were going over every regulations, and at the end of maybe a couple of days of them working on it, and everybody's kind of satisfied and they're ready to leave. At the end,
That's
people are
when
putting
Audi
on their
goes.
coats. And that's when Audi goes, "Oh, you guys okay if we run four-wheel drive?" And everybody was just like, "Oh, I just want to go home. Like we've been doing this for hours. Like, yeah, sure, whatever, sure." And that's the only way four-wheel drive got legal, because it was banned beforehand. So I think it's
Yeah.
an incredible story. Very smart on Audi's part,
And
wear
it's
them
so
down,
cheeky
and
too. Yeah.
then yeah. So kind of leads us to the last kind of motorsport, more recent. I don't know, some probably purists are going to complain that we even brought this into the list, but we're going to be talking about esports, which has been, taking slowly some growth and becoming bigger, and then had an explosion during COVID in the last 2 years when, racetracks and in-person stuff all got banned. Well, you saw a lot of things move online for a season, and real race car drivers go to esport. Do you want to talk us through what happened?
Yeah. So during, our lockdown times, Formula E held some events where, they were trying to take these events very, very seriously. And, they were running them as if it was an actual race. Well, the Audi driver, Daniel Apt, didn't feel like, well, it's just a computer game. So I don't really have to race in this. And I'm not that good at the computer game version. I'd rather drive the real car. So he got a professional sim racer to sit in and do the race for him under his name. And now it was figured out during the race that it wasn't actually Daniel Apt behind the wheel, because the whole time there was something blocking the driver's face from you being able to see who it was.
That's crazy.
And the driver never spoke either. Like they no communications came from that car. You also look like in other events, there have been guys who, have said over their broadcast, "Oh, I'm taking him out," and then they go crash into him. It's like, well, you can't say I'm gonna go take him out and then take him out. Everybody knows you did it. So there was stuff like that. There were some NASCAR drivers got fined for purposely crashing in races, and there was an incident with the virtual Indy 500 last year with Lando Norris came up and made a nice move, and there was some controversy about it. The move was completely legal, and the next lap, Lando just got absolutely rear-ended because this guy
Got
felt he did him
smoked. Yeah.
dirty.
Yeah.
And so it, you see like, and it's because it's sim racing, they're not going to take it as seriously. If they crash the car, there's no monetary issues. They don't get hurt if they crash. It's just a computer game. And then also looking at, esports, there are the cheat mods. And I mean, a lot of the servers and stuff do a really good job at, oh, sorry, they do a really good job at monitoring for cheat mods. I've seen videos of like guys who just can go like full lap at Monaco and they just stay flat out the whole time. And it's like, wow, that's pretty easy to pick out. And a lot of times, like you see it in iRacing, that result in an immediate ban from the whole platform. So you're paying $100 a year to be on this platform, and if you cheat on it, they ban you instantly, and there's $100 down the drain for
Yeah.
what you wanted to win a little virtual race. Like there's not that much bragging rights to it.
Yeah. So that wraps up kind of a couple of cheating scandal. Sometimes, people went around the rules. I think what's really interesting is when we talk about cheating, especially in motorsport, there's that distinction between kind of skirting around the rules, like in regulation, just based on what you want to build and engineering and kind of just engineering something that works and that hasn't been specified, that's on the edge, compared to just bad like sportsmanship and just full on cheating and just trying to get glory the wrong way. So I think it's great that we talked about all of that and everything in between. And I'm glad we had this conversation. Very interesting stuff. Who would have thought that when money and fame is on the line, everybody's creativity and will to win just goes up all that much more.
Yeah.
I always
if we
feel
look
sad for
ahead,
the people who play fair. And then
I know, like it, especially like you hear about like some of this stuff is like crazy. Like I would be pissed with like Richard Petty running a huge engine. I would be so mad. I'd be like, man, I ran the whole season with a fair car. And it's
yeah.
disappointing for a lot of guys for sure. Do we
I'm
look ahead
thinking
to
like,
Azerbaijan?
yeah. So next race, Azerbaijan. When's qualification?
Quali starts June 5th at 9 a.m. The race is June
That's
6th
Eastern
at
time for us.
8 a.m. Eastern time for us. Yes, sir.
So yeah, hopefully we get a good race. I think it's interesting because it's a race circuit. Hopefully it's still very well suited for Red Bull to perform well. Ferrari probably going to have a good performance as well with their car. So it should be a great race overall. I'm looking forward to Aston Martin. Hopefully they can outthink and out strategy everybody else and still put on a great show. And hopefully both Mercedes cars crash out. That's what I'm hoping.
And this track is where Lance Stroll got his first podium and the last podium for Williams. So maybe he can work some magic, get back up there.
Yeah, if I'm not wrong, is this the track where both Red Bull of Max Verstappen and Ricciardo crashing each other a couple of years ago?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So there's also like a track where Leclerc a couple of years ago missed a turn and then just started memeing like, I am stupid, I fucked up or whatever, and it's a great meme. So
yeah,
a funny track. Hopefully we get some great racing. I'm excited to finally have some races back on the calendar. What else can we say? Oh yeah, so Wills and I have been talking with our Canadian heritage, and hopefully we can add a little bit of a twist. We're going to be trying to cover a new type of race series.
so it's
if you want to
the
talk a little bit about it.
Yeah. So I've had some spare time over the weekend and was just casually looking up Canadian amateur race series because I figure I'm probably going to get my own car soon and might as well try and race it maybe. So I came across the Canadian Touring Car Championship. So they run TCR cars, which are little hatchback front wheel drive cars. And then they also run fully homologated GT4 cars. So I think they're doing 5 or 6 races this season. For the first time, it's going to be televised on TSN. So that's pretty exciting stuff. So I saw that and sort of sent over to Simon, hey, is this something you'd be interested in sort of covering and taking a look at? And, I think it's also a chance to highlight, some great tracks in Canada that don't get talked about very much. I think a lot of people assume we only have, the street circuit in Toronto for the IndyCar and the Circuit de Gilles Villeneuve in Montreal for the F1. So there are plenty of tracks in Canada that provide great racing and many that hosted Formula One events in the past. So they'll be going to some of those tracks. Hopefully we'll get to know some drivers, maybe see some expand into some other motorsports, see if there's some guys we can maybe follow.
Yeah. I love it. I agree. And like, I loved what you say about the different tracks because it's very true. And like a couple of summers ago, I worked at Trois-Rivières and they have a track which is really interesting. There's a track in Tremblant. I don't know if they're going to be racing there, but yeah, there's definitely a lot of tracks around. And I think it's great that they, that they have kind of some exposition. Last thing, I guess, before we wrap it up, as you guys can see, we kind of have this format. We're trying a lot of things. Things are changing. Feel free to leave a comment. Tell us what you like, what you don't like. Next week, I should have a mic as well. So Wills and I will both look even more professional with some nice mics. Yeah, tell us if you like our new intro song. I kind of asked a friend and he whipped it up for us, and we were both very happy with it. But yeah, tell us what you like, what you don't like. That kind of wraps it up for me. Thank you very much, everybody, to tune in. Hopefully you've enjoyed this episode. We'll be back to primarily F1 next week, talking about the race. Will, last words?
Yeah, thank you everybody for tuning in. Like, comment, subscribe, and an extra thank you to Patrick Thompson for making our theme song. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.